All right. Okay, this is Parshas Tetzave, and the most of Parshas Tetzave deals with the Aaron, the clothes of Aaron, the clothes for the Kohanim. But what is unique about Parshas Tetzave is that Parshas Tetzave it does not have Moshe Rabbeinu's name mentioned in it, and all the Sedras from the time from Shemos has the name of Moshe Rabbeinu mentioned in it. So some of the Mefarshim, it's not a very difficult question, but nevertheless, they are somewhat baffled as to why Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned in Parshas Tetzave. Now, the Baal HaTurim asks the question, and he says something that I have some problems with for a number of reasons, but he says that the reason is because Moshe Rabbeinu, at the time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu became angry at the Jewish people, and he had threatened that he will destroy the Jewish people, but that Moshe himself will nevertheless remain a great person and will be given a new challenge. So Moshe Rabbeinu said to him, erase me from this Parsha, from this Sedra, from this book, meaning the Torah, Asher Kasafta. In a sense, I guess that part of the idea is based on the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrote figuratively the Torah before the world was created. And the Torah was to play a big role in the perpetuation and the continuation of the world. As a matter of fact, the world was created for the sake of the Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu and the Torah were one. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without Klal Yisrael, I want to have no part. I want to have no part of it. And even though the Jewish people, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not destroy the Jewish people, on the contrary, but nevertheless, Kilas Chacham, the curse of a Chacham, I don't know that this is necessarily a curse per se, but the comment that Moshe Rabbeinu made, erase me from the book that you wrote, was fulfilled through Parshas Tetzave. There is a number of difficulties with this. First of all, the Sedras were somewhat arbitrary. When the Torah was given, the Torah wasn't given with the Sedras. The one who formulated the Sedras in all probability was Ezra HaSofer. So the question is, certainly at the time the Torah was given, there was no Sedras. So how was it fulfilled? How was it fulfilled what Moshe Rabbeinu said? And so now there is a machlokus. It's interesting. There is a machlokus, a dispute between the Ritva and according to Maritzchias, the Rambam disagrees. We very often find, and I've mentioned this before, we very often find that the Gemara, in mentioning a rabbinic law at the Rabbanan, will give an Asmachtos, will give some words in the Torah as a foundation for that takana. They will associate that takana, that decree that the rabbis made with words in the Torah. According to the way the Maritzchias understood the Rambam, and this is the way I think that we understood it when we were taught in the school as young children, the idea of Asmachtos was, in those days, there was no Torah Shabbal Peh. The oral tradition was not written down. It was oral. And of course, there was no text. There wasn't even an oral text. Not only there wasn't a written text, there wasn't an oral text. But the Chumash, the Tanakh, was well known to the Jewish people. They all could have become professors of Bible, maybe. So in order for the people to remember some of the takanos, some of the decrees of the rabbis associated their decrees with words in the Torah, even though it really had nothing to do with the meaning of the words as they were given in the Torah. But it was sort of like an educational method that if they'll associate with words of the Torah, the words of the Torah will remind them of the Takonos Chachamim, of the rabbinical decrees. However, the Ritva and the Maharal, in the strongest of languages, disagrees with this. And they say, Chas v'shalom, and they say that really the Asmachta, when the Gemara associates, when the Talmud associates a rabbinic decree with words in the Torah, it wasn't just an educational trick, but it was an actual Xeris HaKasav. In other words, the rabbis needed the authority of the Torah to allow them to institute their decrees. So it was a drasha, but very often, most of the time, when we have drashos mentioned in the Gemara, the laws that were derived are considered biblical laws. Here, but there are forms of drashos that the Bible, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Tanakh, it empowers the rabbis, if they feel that it's necessary, to make certain takanas chachamim, to make certain decrees. Actually, with this, we could answer one of the famous questions. The Rambam already raised the question. Of course, the Rambam had a different approach altogether. The question is, how could the Chachamim add to the Torah? How could they make new decrees? There's a prohibition about Tosef, do not add to the Torah. But if we say that there are Xeris HaKasuvs, there are indications in the Pasuk, in the words of the Pasuk, that empowers the rabbis to make certain decrees, then that the question doesn't even begin. So we could suggest, if Ezra came and Ezra instituted Sedrus, so it did not originate with Ezra. Ezra, who certainly Ezra HaSofer, he knew the rules of how to understand the Torah, how to make drashos in the Torah. And he understood on the basis of the drashos where the Sedros should begin and where the Sedros should end once they are decreed. And consequently, the question of the Balaturim is a significant question. Why is it that in Parshas Tetzave, there is no mention of Moshe Rabbeinu's name? Because the Sedrus, yes, it was Ezra who put the Cedros into force. But the truth is that there was an indication in the Torah itself that Ezra was aware of that indicated to him where the Cedros should begin and where the Cedros should end. And consequently, he said, because Moshe Rabbeinu said, erase me from the book that you wrote. But it's interesting. It wasn't only until the time of Ezra that this decree went into force. And we have to understand, why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu, the fulfillment of Moshe Rabbeinu's words, took place only later in the time of Ezra? Okay, now, but when we look at the first answer, the answer of the Baal HaTorah, so one thing comes across, what is emphasized is Moshe Rabbeinu's devotion to the Jewish people. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was ready to sacrifice himself for the Jewish people. And in a sense, that tells us about Jewish leadership. Now, I have discussed in the past the dispute, the machlokes between Korach v'Adaso, as Chazal say, or the dispute between Korach and Moshe. Korach led a rebellion against Moshe. And Korach used the words, he said, Koleida kulam doshim v'sochem Hashem. Korach talked about the Jewish people. But ultimately we know that Korach was really talking about himself. Korach was not motivated by the interests of the Jewish people. Korach, as our sages tell us, felt that he was deprived of the role of leadership. And it's because of that he led what he considered to be, what he tried to paint as a popular rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, when we compare, the Torah tells us by Korach, by Yikach Korach. Korach took, but the Torah doesn't tell us what Korach took, only that Korach took. Rashi asked the question at the beginning of Parshas Korach, what did Korach take? And Rashi suggests that he took himself aside from Klal Yisrael to lead a rebellion against Moshe. He took leaders of the Jewish people together with him, Mashach Rashi Sanhedrios, in his rebellion against Moshe. But the question is, why doesn't the Torah tell us? The Torah gives us an incomplete sentence. If I, in elementary school, would have written a sentence, Vayikach Korach, and that was the end of the sentence, they would have taken points. They would have taken points off my paper. It's an incomplete sentence. So why did it say, why did the Torah write it incomplete? And I think the reason the Torah, and I've mentioned this before, that the Torah wrote an incomplete sentence because the Torah wants to tell us what really motivated Korach to lead his rebellion against Moshe. Korach saw leadership as a position that offered the opportunity of taking more and more. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, as well as Shmuel Hanavi, when he defended his leadership, when the Jewish people wanted a king appointed, they saw Jewish leadership as a position that offered opportunities to give rather than to take. Moshe Rabbeinu was there for the Jewish people. Shmuel Hanavi was there for the Jewish people. They didn't take anything. Es chamor milakachti. Because ideal form of Jewish leadership manifests itself in giving rather than taking. It's devotion to the people who you are leading that motivates the true Jewish leader. Whereas Korach, he said, Mikolei de kulam doshim. But it was a little bit like when I was in elementary school, we at that time, because of the Cold War, we had to read Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but there are just some animals more equal than others. Korach saw it that as a position of taking. And the truth of the matter is, and I mentioned it before, that this is the whole, what went on between Rus and in the Megillus Rus, with Rus and Boaz and Naomi and Elimelech. Elimelech, he saw himself as the leader of the Jewish people. In fact, the words Elimelech, our sages tell us, Eli Melech, to me belongs royalty, kingship. But then, when there was starvation in Judah, in Yehuda, when there was famine, Elimelech abandons his people to stay Moab. Why? Because he was interested in Jewish leadership, but he was interested in a Jewish leadership that involved taking rather than giving. And that at that point, he could no longer take. There was a demand for him to give. And consequently, he goes to stay Moab. But then Rus helps Naomi. And Boaz helps Rus and Naomi. Gives them respectability. Gives them what to eat. Eventually marries Rus. And that's the foundation of Malchus Beis David, the foundation of the Jewish royal house, because the ideal Jewish leadership manifests itself in giving rather than taking. Now, so in a sense, but when you give because of your concern for the people. And this is what the idea is emphasized in order to let us know that and I think in a sense it's in order to let us know that Moshe saw his leadership as being significant because it was for the Jewish people. He was devoted to the Jewish people. Now, then there's another answer given. I think I saw it also in maybe a different text of the Balaturim. Let me just see if it's. Okay, so it's not this edition about term. I saw it from one of the Sfarim that the reason Moshe's name is not mentioned is because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu approached a Moshe to take position of leadership, so to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, for 7 days, Moshe Rabbeinu refused to assume that role in helping liberate the Jewish people from Egypt. And he gave all kinds of excuses that were pushed aside by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Excuses based on the fact that Aaron was the leader of the Jewish people up till that point. Excuses because he was kvad peh. He had difficulty talking clearly. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu retorted, Misam pel adam. And ultimately, Moshe agrees that together with Aaron, he will take the Jewish people out of Egypt. But because for 7 days he refused HaKadosh Baruch Hu's appointment that he go and take the Jewish people out of Egypt, so because of that, he lost the Kahuna Gdola, the high priesthood. Ideally, he should have become the Kohen Gadol. And here where it talks about Aaron becoming the Kohen Gadol, because of that, Moshe's name is not mentioned. And the question is, what is this all about? And why did Moshe Rabbeinu try to refuse the position when HaKadosh Baruch Hu offered it to him? I think it's more than just the excuses that Moshe Rabbeinu gave. But Moshe Rabbeinu saw. Now, I just before I say that, I just want to mention that this Sedra talks about the clothes that Aaron HaKohen wore. The clothes that Aaron HaKohen wore, that was his uniform. And the clothes that the Kohanim wore, that was their uniform. A uniform is something that is identified with a certain position. Policemen wear special uniforms. Firemen wear special uniforms. So Kohanim were given special uniforms. The Rambam explains it in Mar Nevuchim, I think, in order that the people should be awed. But that was the Rambam's position in terms of the whole Beis HaMikdash, in order to impress the people. Now, I think for Moshe Rabbeinu, for the 7 days, the Shivas Yemei HaMeluim, the 7 days when Moshe Rabbeinu acted as the Kohen Gadol, when Moshe Rabbeinu did all the avodah, all the service, so Moshe Rabbeinu wore simple white clothes. He didn't wear the uniform of Aaron HaKohen. We have to understand, why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu did not wear the special clothes that were designated for the Kohen Gadol? And the simple answer is that Moshe Rabbeinu had no need for a uniform. Moshe Rabbeinu, his greatness was not in any position. We refer to him as Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher. He wasn't a teacher, a job. He was who he was. That was his very being. In a sense, yes, Yehoshua replaced Moshe. But in a sense, no one replaced Moshe. Yehoshua was Yehoshua. And he perhaps took over the leadership. He became a leader of the Jewish people. But he really didn't replace Moshe in any way. And however, Kahuna Gdola was a position. It's interesting. Reb Chaim was against official positions of Torah leadership. That was one of the reasons he disassociated himself from Agudas Yisrael. And when at the Katowice conference, one of the main reasons was he didn't like the idea of the Moetzah Stolei Torah. What was the problem? He says the people that are Gdolim will be recognized as Gdolim. He says once you have a position, a person becomes a Gadol because he has the position. There is a danger that a person will be recognized as a Gadol because he has a position. It's not that we give a position to a Gadol. It was a fear, and a well-founded fear, that the people will be recognized as Gdolim because of the position that they occupy. So now, of course, that was more dangerous in Reb Chaim's time than it was in the early generations of Jewish people. But there are people that are special because of who they were. The Chavetz Chaim, who was on the Moetzah Stolei Torah, he didn't have any real position. His greatness was recognized long before he was on the Moetzah Stolei Torah. His greatness did not derive from the position. If anything, the position derived greatness from him. Didn't have what did he do? He ran a store. Okay, he also had a yeshiva, but he wasn't the official. He wasn't even the official Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva. Of course, he was the living spirit of the yeshiva. But he didn't have his greatness did not emanate from his position. So now Aaron was also personally very great. And Aaron could have had a real leadership as a person, offered real leadership as a person without a position. But the Kahuna Gdola was something that was given over from generation to generation. And it was necessary to create a position in order that it be given over for generation to generation. If Aaron HaKohen was the Kohen Gadol, and there would be no Kohen Gadol after him, I do not think that there would have been a need for a special uniform. But the reason there was a need for a special uniform for Aaron HaKohen was because of the future generations. The future generations, there would be people who, in a sense, might have been great people, but as a result of their position, their greatness rose somewhat. So it was necessary to create a position of Kohen Gadol because of the future generations. Aaron HaKohen, had it been only himself, He could have worn the same cloak that Moshe Rabbeinu wore. But there was a certain degree of inheritance, or even if it wasn't a ben after ben, son after son, but it was a position that was to be filled by future generations. Position demands, very often, position demands uniform. And I think that this is that. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu reject it? Because Moshe Rabbeinu's perception of leadership was a position. And when one has the position of leadership, there has to be a certain aura. There has to be a certain degree of people looking up to him. And it sometimes happens overnight. Yesterday, he was your buddy. Today, he's your leader. I remember reading in the paper that when John Kennedy was elected president, so he was in Hyannisport and listening to the results, and all his family that played football with him all the time, whatever it is. But after the results of the election were announced and he walked into the room, everybody stood up. Overnight, he became the leader of the free world. He was elected to a position. He wasn't any greater a minute later than he was a minute earlier. But the position, to a certain degree, made him greater. So it's the need for the big day kahuna, I don't think was because of Aaron Cohen himself, but it had to associate the future generations with Aaron Cohen. When the Torah tells us what the Kohen HaGadol has to do in future generations, it talks about Aaron. Very often it talks about Aaron doing it, especially by the Avod of Yom Kippurim. Why? Because so the position was necessary to associate future generations with Aaron Cohen. And it's interesting that regarding the tzitz that was a gold headband, I guess, that went over the forehead. The words Kodesh LaShem, holy to God, was on those letters. Those words were on the head, the golden headband that went from ear to ear. And the Chachamim, the Gemara in Sukkah tells us that the Chachamim said the name of God had to be on top, and Kodesh had to be at the bottom. Now, Tosfos brings down that some had the name of God on top, and directly underneath it was the words Kodesh La. The Rambam Shita is similar, but the Rambam Shita is that the word Kodesh was at the bottom, and La Hashem, to God, holy, was at the bottom of the headband, and on the top of the headband was inscribed La Hashem, to God. Now the Tosfos has problems with it. He says it just doesn't make sense, especially if you have the Kodesh La at the bottom. So it just doesn't read correct. You have God's name. First, you have God's name, and underneath it, you have the Kodesh La Hashem. Oh yeah. Underneath you have the Kodesh LaHashem. So so that we have to understand. We have to understand why is it that so Tosfos says it because we read from top to bottom. So you'll have the words Hashem Kodesh La. Doesn't make sense. So Tosfos says that the word Kodesh, Kodesh is at was at the right side at the bottom, and Lashem was in the middle towards the left. Lashem, so it could still be read Kodesh Lashem because in Hebrew we read from right to left. But the other commentaries don't say that. The other commentaries have that God's name directly on top of the Kodesh La, or La Hashem, God's name at top and Kodesh at the bottom. How are we to understand it? But I think the way we can understand it is that the Kodesh, that there are certain people that when you look at them, you see special features, unique features. And there are certain people that you have to be told about them to see how special they are. Now, a matter of fact, my grandmother once said a shot. It goes against the older Mefarshim in Tanakh. Actually, they explain it the very opposite way. When Shaul kept Agag alive, Shaul kept Agag alive, and Shmuel was very angry because he was told to destroy all of Amalek. So Shmuel complained to Shaul. So Shaul gave Agag over to Shmuel to do with him as he was commanded. Now he was commanded to kill him, but Agag didn't know that. When he saw he was being given over to Shmuel, he said, "Achein sar mar hamavis." The bitterness of death has left me. In other words, so long as he was held as a prisoner, he was scared that he would be executed. For all the Jewish people that he executed, for all the Jewish people that he killed, for all the Jewish mothers who he made them lose their children. But then when he was given over to Shmuel, so he said, I don't have to fear the bitterness of death anymore. So my grandmother said, well, why not? So the Mefarshim say, when he said Mavis, the bitterness of death was greater. He realized that he was going to die. My grandmother said, no, he didn't realize. When he saw the face of Shmuel, he said, someone with that type of face is not capable of killing. He saw such righteousness. He saw such righteousness, but he was so he said Sor Mahamavis because he thought that from here on the threat of death did not hang over his head, but God commanded Amalek has to be wiped out. And as Shmuel told him, Shmuel responded, just as you made Jewish women lose their children, your mother will lose her child as well. So because of that, he was killed. But some people, when you look at their face, you see who they are. And I just want to interrupt here for a second. And I want to say that this is the difference to a large degree, of course, in a different form and shape, not talking about Shmuel HaNavi, between European Jews. When I talk about European Jews, I'm not talking about the Jews living in France today or England today. I'm talking the Jews of the shtetl that lived in the shtetl. When you saw their faces, Unfortunately, there are very few among us now, among us. But when I was younger, there was a large part of the population. You saw goodness. You saw modesty. I want to mention, I neglected to mention at the beginning, that this year is dedicated because the art site of Sonia Borg. Oh, she was a member of my shul. Her daughter has asked me to dedicate the share. I do every year, dedicate the share in the memory. I'm very close friends with the family, and with her and her husband, you saw those were the European Jews. I would call it unsophisticated goodness, true goodness. It wasn't the show, because that was their personality. That was who they were. And I think that perhaps with this understanding that with certain people, you could recognize who they are with their face. We can understand the idea of the tzitz. The Rambam says it's based on Gemaras, but for the Gemaras it doesn't say it the way the Rambam says. The Rambam says that ideally the tzitz should have had the words La Hashem, to God, on top, and directly underneath it the word Kodesh and the holy. And so the question is, we read, so okay, the words make sense, but that's not what the Torah says. If you say La Hashem, to God, holy, it should be holy to God. That the sentence doesn't make the way we read it doesn't make any sense. But the answer is, what do we notice first? Do we notice the uniform first? Do we notice the tzitz first? Or we notice the personality as it's expressed in the face first? There were generations of the Kohanim Dolim, certainly in the first base of Mikdash, that you saw the face, you saw the holiness. The first thing you saw was their face. And you looked up. And when you looked up, you saw the words Kodesh and then Lashem, to God. Because what made the impression wasn't the uniform. What made the impression was the personality on the face. That's what made the impression. So because of that, so the Rambam says, yes, ideally it should be Kodesh on the bottom and Lashem on top. But sometimes, and it's mentioned that the Rabbi Yossi saw in Rome, when they sacked the Beis Hamikdash, they took the tzitz with them. Sometimes they had the word Kodesh Lashem in one line. Well, if ideally it should be on two separate lines, how is it that sometimes it was on one line? I think there were generations where the first thing you noticed was the holiness of the face. Before you noticed the tzitz, what made the impression was the face of the person, that emanated the goodness, the holiness, the uniqueness. That's what made the first impression. And then you looked up. So you saw the bottom line first, Kodesh, then on top you saw Lashem, to God. But towards the end of the second base of Mikdash, there was a lot of corruption. And even those that weren't corrupt, there probably were times where the holiness did not emanate so much from the person and apparent on the face, but it emanated from the position. And with many of them, the position did make them holy. It did have an impact on them. The uniform had an impact, not just, as the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, to influence the perspective of the people on the outside, but the uniform made an impression on them to influence themselves. They knew that once they occupied that position, they had to be a different type of person. So in the second Beis Hamikdash, toward the end of the second Beis Hamikdash, when they sacked the Beis Hamikdash, when they took away from the Beis Hamikdash, what did they take? What did Rome take? They took the tzitz. The tzitz at that time had Kodesh Lashem in one line, because before you noticed the face of the Kohen, it wasn't the face of the Kohen. It wasn't the Kohen that made the impression. It was the uniform that made the impression. So the holiness emanated from the uniform, from the tzitz. And then you came to recognize that the person was holy. But you should know that even that was a madrega, that is a great madrega, is a great accomplishment. You have people that they have natural greatness. You have people that get greatness because of the situation, because of the position, because of the uniform. But you have people that the greatness is only in the uniform. It's not in them themselves. It's very interesting. There's a very interesting medrash. The medrash says the medrash says there were 3 kalim utensils in the Beis Hamikdash that had a zer, that had a crown around it. The Aron, the Mizbach HaKtoris, and also the Shulchan. It had a crown around it. The Aron's crown was a different sort of crown, but whatever. And the Medrash uses strange language. The Medrash says that if you look at the letters by themselves, the word is zor, strange, foreign. A foreign, a non-Kohen who does the avodah is a zor. But a Kohen, but if you read it zer. What does the Medrash mean? What we read is what we see. If it's only what we see, it's not even a uniform, it's a costume. It's foreign. There has to be some connection between the uniform and the person. Either the person gives greatness to the uniform, to the position, or the position gives greatness to the person. But if the uniform doesn't give, if there is no connection between the uniform and the person, if there's no connection between the uniform and the person, then it's just a costume. So Aaron didn't need the uniform, but future generations needed the uniform to have an impact on them, to make them greater. But unfortunately today, we don't have kahuna, we don't have any kahuna, but we have a lot of costumes. We have people with uniforms also. But we have to always be on guard that when the special clothes are worn, there's a story, I forgot who the story is about. A certain Chassidish Rabbi was on the train, and Reb Chaim was sitting on the train, and Reb Chaim, he never dressed really special, but when he went on the train, he wore a cap. He didn't even wear his rabbinic hat. He went to the Chassidish Rebbe. I forgot what it was. Biala Rebbe. I don't remember which Rebbe it was. He went over to Reb Chaim and he addressed him. I'm sure Reb Chaim was not too happy. Holy Rabbi of Brisk, how is it that you dress this way? Reb Chaim did not need a uniform. It's true he had a position, but Reb Chaim's greatness, even though the position was a great position, the Beis Halevi had it before him, and all the Rabbanim of Bris were the Gedolei Hador from previous generation, Rabbi Shulei Diskin. But Reb Chaim's greatness didn't come from his position. It didn't come from his uniform. If anything, he gave greatness to his position. He gave greatness to his uniform. He didn't really have a uniform. So Aaron really didn't need all these clothes, but future generations, in order to identify with Aaron. And that did have an impact upon them. It was necessary. But there were certain generations where the greatness came from the people to the uniform. And there were certain generations where the greatness came from the uniform, from the tzitz to the people. And that's why. So Moshe didn't want leadership because initially Moshe Rabbeinu thought leadership was a position. And he felt that he did not have the personality for a position, for an official position. But Aaron was the leader of the Jewish people in Egypt. And he, in a sense, and that was a position recognized by the people. He didn't need it. So if it was a position, he saw himself as taking Aaron away from his position. He saw leadership as a position. And he didn't feel, on one hand, that he was good for a position, and the other hand, he saw himself taking Aaron away from the position. But the truth is that both Moshe and Aaron were leaders not because of their position. And Aaron, who had a position, who was a necessity to eventually get a position, it was he who gave greatness to the position. It was he who gave greatness to the uniform of the Kohen Gadol. This is what I think, way we can understand this other answer that's given. Now, and in a sense, we could say that, in other words, that was fulfilled at the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, which I mentioned earlier, that the Mechenina Mesifrecha Asher Kasavta, which was fulfilled at the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, was at a time when Jewish leadership, even in the Kahuna Gdola, not at the very beginning, but later on, it wasn't the people giving greatness to the position. It was the position giving greatness to the people. So that's the point where, in a sense, it was necessary to disassociate, to take away Moshe Rabbeinu's name, because Moshe, more than anybody else, represented the idea of greatness of the person, with total disregard for position. So Moshe Rabbeinu is removed to a certain degree this Sedra from the time of Ezra. Why? To emphasize the greatness of the position, that the position got greatness from Aaron. And the idea at that point, greatness of the person to a certain degree ceased to exist. So Moshe, who represents the idea of greatness of the person, his name from that point on in the history of the Jewish people is removed. I just want to reiterate what I mentioned before, that the this year was dedicated memory of Sonia Borg because of her yahrzeit, and she and her husband, they had that special European Jewish personality. They were modest people. They weren't interested in kavod. They weren't interested in anything. They wore who they wore. They didn't need anything special. They didn't need position. They didn't need honor. Their greatness was in who they were. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Well, I guess it was pretty clear. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I hear you.
No questions. Thank you. Have a good week.
Okay, you too.
We'll see everyone next week.
Yeah. Okay.